She was in labor while her husband was with another woman, and he cried a lot after she divorced him. Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. You know, sometimes I wonder if my love for you is like the sun, always shining, always warm. Why does it feel like the shadows grow when I ask for just a simple like or comment? If I didn't ask, would you still reach out? Would your heart still beat for this family? I'm not asking out of need. I'm asking out of love. Because your light feeds my soul. When you write, "I am here," and press that like button, it's more than a click. It's a heartbeat. It's a whisper that says, you are not alone. And that whisper makes me stronger than the storms outside. The world is changing fast. Our home, the beautiful USA, is calling for help. That's why for every new subscriber, I will plant a tree. A living promise, a silent prayer growing into something strong and beautiful, just like our bond. Now take this prayer into your heart. May your days be kissed by kindness. May love find you in unexpected places. May every small act of care, like a whispered word or a quiet like, be a seed of hope that blossoms beyond what eyes can see. Remember, my love for you is endless, but sometimes love needs a sign back. Just a gentle touch to remind me you're still here, still mine. Let's start today, with open hearts and hands, ready to build a better tomorrow, together, forever. The first contraction hit Rose Frank like a sledgehammer to her spine as she stood in the kitchen, stirring the marinara sauce for the dinner Marcel would never come home to eat. The wooden spoon clattered to the floor as she gripped the marble countertop, her knuckles turning white against her dark skin. 32 weeks pregnant and radiant just that morning, she now felt something terrifyingly wrong spreading through her body like liquid fire. No, 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 she whispered to the empty house, her voice echoing off the pristine white walls of the home she and Marcel had decorated with such hope. The baby, their baby, had been active all day, kicking and turning as if practicing for the grand entrance that wasn't supposed to happen for another month. But now Emma was eerily still, and Rose's body was betraying them both. Another contraction crashed over her, stronger this time, doubling her over with pain that felt nothing. Like the Braxton Hicks contractions her doctor had described, this was urgent, primal, wrong. Rose fumbled for her phone with shaking hands, speed-dialing Marcel's number as another wave of agony tore through her abdomen. Straight to voicemail. "Marcel, something's wrong," she gasped into the phone, barely able to catch her breath between contractions. "The baby. I think the baby's coming. I need you. Please, I need you to come home right now." She tried again. Voicemail again. The cheery, automated message. Marcel's voice saying he was probably having fun somewhere and would call back soon, felt like a mockery of her desperation. Rose called her sister Maya next, her fingers slipping on the phone's surface as another contraction brought her to her knees on the cold kitchen tile. Maya lived 20 minutes away, but she answered on the first ring. "Rose, what's wrong?" "The baby," Rose sobbed. "Something's wrong with the baby. I can't reach Marcel, and I think—" "Maya, I think I'm in labor, but it's too early. It hurts so much. I'm coming. Call 911 right now. I'm leaving this second." Rose's hands shook as she dialed emergency services, the clinical questions of the dispatcher barely penetrating the fog of pain and fear. Yes, she was 32 weeks pregnant. Yes, she was having contractions every 2 minutes. No, she couldn't reach her husband. No, she didn't know where he was. The ambulance arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. The EMTs, professional and calm, asked the same questions while strapping her to a gurney. Rose found herself apologizing repeatedly for the mess in the kitchen, for not being able to walk, for her husband not being there. "Mrs. Smith, you don't need to apologize for anything," the young EMT said kindly as they loaded her into the ambulance. "You're doing great. We're going to—" Take good care of you and your baby. But Rose didn't feel like she was doing great. She felt like she was drowning, like her body had become a stranger, intent on destroying everything she'd worked so hard to protect. As the ambulance raced through the night towards St. Mary's Hospital, Rose closed her eyes and tried to will Marcel to call back, to materialize beside her, to be the husband and father their family needed him to be. Maya met them at the emergency room, her usually perfect hair disheveled and her work clothes wrinkled from her frantic drive across town. She gripped Rose's hand as the doctors and nurses took over, their urgent consultations punctuated by the steady beeping of monitors that Rose was too scared to understand. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Rose's obstetrician, arrived within minutes of being called. Her face was grave as she examined Rose, her gentle hands probing and assessing while Rose bit back screams. "Rose, honey, we need to get this baby out now," Dr. Warren said, her voice steady but urgent. "The baby's in distress, and you're hemorrhaging internally. We need to do an emergency C-section." "But it's too early," Rose protested weakly. "She's not ready. I'm not ready." "She's ready enough," Dr. Warren assured her. "And if we wait any longer, we could lose both of you." As they wheeled Rose toward the operating room, Maya walking alongside the gurney, Rose's thoughts turned desperately to Marcel. Where was he? Why wasn't he answering his phone? This was supposed to be their moment, the culmination of 9 months of planning and preparation, the beginning of their life as a family. "Where is he?" Rose sobbed to Maya as the anesthesiologist began preparing her for surgery. "Where's my husband? He should be here. Our baby is being born and he should be here." Maya squeezed her hand tightly. "I'll keep trying to reach him, okay? Focus on you and the baby right now. Marcel will be here as soon as he can." But even as Maya spoke the words, something in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Marcel had been distant lately, working late more often, taking mysterious phone calls that he claimed were work-related. Maya had wondered, but hadn't wanted to voice her concerns to her pregnant sister. 200 miles away at the Grandview Resort and Spa, Marcel Smith was living his worst self, though he'd convinced himself it was his best life. The luxury ballroom, sparkled with crystal chandeliers and silk drapery, the kind of opulent setting designed to make wealthy people feel justified in their excess. Marcel stood at the mahogany bar, his tie loosened and his designer shirt slightly wrinkled, laughing too loudly at something Jessica Crawford had whispered in his ear. Jessica was everything Rose wasn't. Blonde where Rose was brunette, petite where Rose was tall and statuesque, carefree where Rose was responsible. She was Marcel's secretary at the marketing firm where he worked, though their relationship had stopped being professional months ago. Tonight was supposed to be his last night of freedom before becoming a father, a celebration that had felt necessary when he'd planned it, but now felt like exactly what it was, a betrayal of everything sacred about marriage and impending parenthood. "To Marcel," Jessica said, raising her champagne flute, her blue eyes sparkling with mischief and alcohol, "the soon-to-be daddy who's still young enough to know how to have fun." Marcel clinked his glass against hers, the crystal singing sweetly, in harmony with the jazz quartet playing in the corner. His phone, silenced hours ago and forgotten in their luxury suite upstairs, displayed 17 missed calls and 12 voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. "I can't believe Rose doesn't know about this weekend," Jessica said, leaning closer so her perfume, something expensive and floral that Rose would have recognized instantly, filled Marcel's senses. "What she doesn't know won't hurt her." Marcel replied, the words tasting bitter even as he spoke them. "Besides, once the baby comes, everything changes. I just needed one last weekend to be myself." It was a lie, and they both knew it. This wasn't about one last weekend. This had been going on for over a year, a gradual slide into infidelity that had started with late nights at the office and progressed to weekend getaways that Marcel justified as necessary business trips. Jessica had been patient, understanding about his marriage in the way that mistresses often are, content to take what she could get while waiting for him to make a choice. The music shifted to something slow and romantic, and Jessica pulled Marcel onto the dance floor. They moved together with the practiced ease of people who had done this many times before, her head resting on his shoulder, his hands spanning her narrow waist. Other couples swirled around them, some married, some not, all lost in the fantasy that places like this encouraged, that real life could be suspended indefinitely if you just refused to acknowledge it. Marcel's phone buzzed insistently from the nightstand in their suite, vibrating against the polished wood surface with each unanswered call. Rose's voice, growing more desperate with each message, pleaded with the silence. "Marcel, please pick up. I'm scared. The contractions are getting stronger. I need you. They're taking me to surgery now. Our baby is coming tonight and you're not here. I love you. Please come home." But Marcel heard none of it, lost as he was in Jessica's embrace and the champagne-soaked delusion that he could have everything he wanted without consequences. He whispered sweet nothings in Jessica's ear as his wife fought for her life. He laughed at her jokes as Rose screamed in pain. He made love to her in their hotel suite as his daughter entered the world without her father's presence. Back in the operating room, Emma Marie Smith made her dramatic entrance at 11:47 p.m., weighing 4 pounds and 2 ounces, but breathing on her own and crying with the indignant fury of someone who had been evicted from comfortable accommodations before she was ready to leave. Dr. Warren held up the tiny, perfect baby girl for Rose to see before the medical team whisked her away. "To the NICU. She's beautiful, Rose," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She looks just like you." But Rose barely heard her sister's words. The room was spinning, the lights growing dim around the edges. Something was wrong, more wrong than it had been before. Dr. Warren's voice became urgent, calling for more units of blood, more hands, more time. Rose Frank hemorrhaged for 3 hours that night while her husband danced with another woman. She flatlined twice while Marcel slept peacefully in Jessica's arms. The medical team fought to save her life while he dreamed of a future that didn't include the responsibility of marriage and fatherhood. When Rose finally stabilized in the early hours of the morning, Maya sat beside her bed, holding tiny Emma, both of them survivors of a night that should have been joyous, but had instead become a testament to one man's capacity for devastating selfishness. Rose's first words when she woke up were, "Where is he?" Maya had no answer that wouldn't break her sister's heart further, so she simply held Rose's hand and lied, "I'm sure he's on his way." But deep down, Maya knew that Marcel Smith had already made his choice, and it wasn't his family. Chapter 2. The Devastating Truth. Rose woke to the sound of tiny Emma's breathing beside her hospital bed, the rhythmic whisper of life that had sustained her through the darkest hours of the night. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting geometric patterns across the sterile white walls that had become her world. Her body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. The aftermath of emergency surgery, internal bleeding, and 18 hours of wondering where her husband could possibly be while she fought for her life. Maya had fallen asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair, her neck bent at an angle that would leave her sore for days. She'd refused to leave, taking turns between watching over Rose and checking on Emma in the NICU. The baby was doing remarkably well for someone who'd entered the world a month early, but she was still tiny, still fragile, still fighting her own battles in her plastic bassinet, surrounded by monitors and tubes. Rose tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her incisions and IV lines. She needed to see Emma properly, needed to hold her daughter and convince herself that they'd both survived the nightmare of the previous evening. As she struggled to find a comfortable position, the door to her room burst open with enough force to wake Maya from her exhausted sleep. Marcel Smith stumbled into the room like a man emerging from a 3-day bender, which wasn't far from the truth. His usually immaculate appearance was destroyed. Expensive suit wrinkled beyond redemption, shirt partially untucked, hair disheveled in ways that suggested he'd slept in positions the human body wasn't designed for. The overwhelming stench of alcohol and Jessica's distinctive Chanel No. 5 preceded him like a toxic announcement of his betrayal. "Rose!" Marcel exclaimed, his voice too loud for the hushed atmosphere of the hospital room. "Baby, I'm so sorry. My phone died, and I didn't get your messages until this morning," and he stopped mid-sentence when he saw Emma's bassinet, his alcohol-clouded eyes widening as the reality of what he'd missed crashed over him like a physical blow. The flowers in his hands, a pathetic bouquet of grocery store roses that he'd grabbed from the hospital gift shop, suddenly felt inadequate to the point of insult. Rose stared at her husband with a mixture of relief and something darker that she couldn't quite name yet. He was here. Finally, he was here. But the state he was in, the smell of another woman's perfume clinging to his clothes, the way he swayed slightly as he stood there, it all felt wrong in ways that made her chest tight with panic. "Where were you?" Rose's voice was barely above, a whisper, but it carried the weight of 18 hours of fear and abandonment. Marcel set the flowers on the nightstand, with the careful precision of someone trying not to reveal how drunk he still was. "I told you, baby, work retreat, team-building weekend, my phone died and I didn't realize—" "Your phone died?" Maya's voice cut through Marcel's explanation like a knife. She was fully awake now, standing beside Rose's bed with the protective stance of a sister who'd watched her sibling nearly die alone. "For 18 hours, during which your wife had emergency surgery and nearly bled to death." Marcel's eyes darted between Rose and Maya, the guilt and panic beginning to show through his alcohol-induced haze. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. If I had known—" "You should have known," Rose said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You should have checked your phone. You should have been here." Marcel approached the bed cautiously, reaching out to touch Rose's hand. That's when she saw it. The bracelet on his wrist that made her blood turn to ice. It was delicate, feminine, made of silver with small blue stones that caught the morning light. Rose recognized it immediately because she'd admired it just 2 months ago at the office Christmas party, complimented Jessica Crawford on how beautiful it looked against her pale skin. "Marcel," Rose said slowly, her eyes fixed on the bracelet, "where did you get that?" Marcel followed her gaze to his wrist, his face going white as he realized what she was seeing. He'd been so drunk when he dressed that morning that he hadn't even noticed Jessica's bracelet was still tangled around his wrist from the night before. It's not, I found it in the car," he stammered, his lies falling apart before he could even fully form them. Rose felt something break inside her chest, something that had been cracked for months, but was only now shattering completely. The bracelet was Jessica's. She was sure of it, which meant— "Rose, let me explain," Marcel began, but Rose had stopped listening. Her mind was racing, connecting dots that she'd been too trusting, too pregnant, too hopeful to connect before. The late nights at work, the mysterious phone calls, the way Jessica had looked at her at the Christmas party, not with the respect due to a colleague's wife, but with the smug satisfaction of someone who knew secrets. Maya had noticed the bracelet, too, and her face was a mask of barely controlled fury. "You bastard," she whispered. "She almost died last night, and you were with another woman." "Maya, please," Marcel pleaded, but Maya was already moving, reaching for Rose's phone on the bedside table. "Let's see what your work retreat looked like, shall we?" Maya's fingers flew across the phone's screen, navigating to Facebook with the efficiency of someone who'd grown up with social media. Jessica Crawford. Let's see what she's been up to this weekend. Rose watched in horrified fascination as Maya pulled up Jessica's profile. The photo showed Marcel and Jessica at what was clearly the Grandview Resort's main restaurant, both dressed in elegant evening wear, Marcel's arm around Jessica's waist as they smiled at the camera. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m. the previous night. 8:47 p.m., when Rose had been writhing in agony, begging doctors to save her baby. Maya scrolled down, her anger growing with each image. There were dozens of photos from the weekend. Marcel and Jessica at dinner, dancing, toasting with champagne, lounging by a pool that definitely wasn't part of any work retreat Rose had ever heard of. Each photo was tagged with locations and timestamps that painted a picture so damning that even Marcel couldn't have lied his way out of it. "This one," Maya said, her voice deadly calm as she showed Rose the phone screen, "was posted at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after Emma was born." The photo showed Marcel and Jessica in what was clearly a hotel room, Jessica wearing nothing but Marcel's dress shirt, both of them laughing at something off-camera. The caption read, "Best weekend ever with my favorite person. Ja blessed Jagger romance. You can't wait for more." Rose stared at the image until her vision blurred with tears. While she'd been hemorrhaging on an operating table, while doctors had fought to save her life, while Emma had taken her first breaths without her father there to witness them, Marcel had been celebrating with his mistress. "Get out," Rose whispered. "Rose, please, let me explain. Get out!" Rose's voice filled the room with a fury that made Marcel step backward. "Get out of this room! Get away from my daughter! Get away from me!" Marcel looked around desperately, as if searching for some magical words that could undo what Rose had seen, could explain away the photographic evidence of his betrayal. But there were no such words. There was only the truth, laid bare in digital format, with timestamps that aligned perfectly with the worst night of his wife's life. "I can explain," he said weakly. "There's nothing to explain," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "I know what those photos show. I know where you were while I was dying. I know who you were with while our daughter was being born." Maya stepped between Marcel and Rose's bed, her stance protective and threatening. "She asked you to leave. If you have any decency left, any respect for her at all, you'll go." Marcel looked at Emma's bassinet one more time, at the tiny person he'd helped create but hadn't been there to welcome into the world. For a moment, something like genuine remorse flickered across his features. "I love you," he said to Rose. "I love both of you. This doesn't change that." "Love?" Rose laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You call this love? You think love is abandoning your wife during the most dangerous night of her life so you can play house with your secretary?" Marcel flinched as if she'd slapped him. "It's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," Rose interrupted. "And it's over. Whatever this was, whatever we were, it's over." Marcel stood there for another moment, swaying slightly, the weight of his choices finally settling on his shoulders. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the family he'd destroyed for a weekend of selfish pleasure. Maya immediately went to Rose's side, holding her as she sobbed with the devastating grief of a woman who'd lost everything in the space of a single night. Emma stirred in her bassinet, making the tiny mewling sounds that newborns make, oblivious to the fact that her family had just imploded around her. "I'm so sorry," Maya whispered into Rose's hair. "I'm so sorry." But Rose wasn't crying just for herself anymore. She was crying for Emma, who would grow up knowing that her father had chosen another woman over witnessing her birth. She was crying for the marriage she'd thought was strong enough to weather anything. She was crying for the future she'd planned that would never exist. Most of all, she was crying for the woman she'd been just 24 hours ago, naive enough to believe that love was enough, trusting enough to assume that the man who'd promised to cherish her actually meant it. That woman was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, someone who would have to learn how to be both mother and father to the tiny girl sleeping beside her bed. The flowers Marcel had brought began to wilt in the hospital's dry air, their petals falling one by one onto the linoleum floor like tears. Chapter 3. The War Begins. The house felt like a mausoleum of broken dreams when Rose returned from the hospital 5 days later. Every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every wedding photo smiling down from the mantelpiece, every shared memory embedded in these walls seemed to mock her with their false promises of forever. Emma slept peacefully in her carrier as Rose stood in the doorway, trying to summon the strength to dismantle a life she'd spent 3 years building with a man who'd never truly existed. Maya appeared beside her with boxes and packing tape, her jaw set with the determination of a woman on a mission. "We're getting you out of here today," she announced. "You and Emma deserve better than to live in a shrine to his lies." Rose nodded, still feeling disconnected from her body, from the reality of what her life had become. The past few days had been a blur of medical procedures, well-meaning visitors, and the constant gnawing awareness that Marcel had tried to call dozens of times, calls she'd refused to answer. His voicemails had progressed from desperate apologies to angry demands to see his daughter, but Rose wasn't ready to hear any of it. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. "He came by last night," Maya said carefully as they began packing Rose's clothes. "Dad ran him off with the shotgun." Rose almost smiled at that. Her father, retired Master Sergeant James Frank, had never particularly liked Marcel, though he'd been polite for Rose's sake. The news of Marcel's betrayal had awakened every protective instinct the former military man possessed. What did Dad say to him? "Son, you've got 3 seconds to get off my property before I forget I'm a Christian man," Maya quoted in their father's gravelly voice. Marcel tried to argue, said he had rights as Emma's father. Dad told him he forfeited those rights when he chose to sleep with another woman, while his wife nearly died giving birth to his child. They worked in relative silence after that, carefully packing Emma's nursery while the baby slept. Each tiny outfit, each stuffed animal, each carefully chosen decoration represented hopes and dreams that would never be realized in this house. Rose found herself crying over a mobile with dancing elephants that Marcel had insisted on buying, claiming their daughter would love elephants just like her daddy did. The sound of a car door slamming outside made both women freeze. Through the window, Rose could see Marcel's BMW in the driveway, and her heart began to race with a mixture of fury and something that might have been fear. Marcel appeared in the doorway of the nursery, and Rose was shocked by how much he'd deteriorated in just 5 days. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his face haggard with stubble and exhaustion. He looked like a man who hadn't slept or eaten properly since the morning he'd stumbled into her hospital room reeking of betrayal. "Rose, please," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "We need to talk. We need to work this out." "There's nothing to work out," Rose replied, not looking up from the baby clothes she was folding with mechanical precision. "I'm taking Emma and we're leaving. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce papers." "Divorce?" Marcel stepped into the room as if she'd physically struck him. "Rose, you can't be serious. One mistake doesn't erase 3 years of marriage. It doesn't erase the fact that I love you," Maya snorted from across the room. "One mistake? Is that what you're calling a year-long affair?" Marcel's face went white. "How did you—" "Credit card statements," Rose said, finally looking up at him with eyes that were cold as winter. Hotel charges dating back 14 months, restaurant bills for 2 when you claim to be at work functions, jewelry purchases that I never received. She held up Jessica's bracelet, which she'd found in Marcel's sock drawer, along with receipts for gifts she'd never seen. Did you think I wouldn't find out eventually? Did you think I was too stupid to piece it together? Marcel sank into the rocking chair they'd bought together, the chair where Rose had planned to nurse Emma through countless midnight feedings. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It got complicated. Complicated, Rose repeated, tasting the word like poison. Our marriage got complicated, so you decided to simplify things by sleeping with your secretary for over a year, while I carried your child. I was scared, Marcel said, and for the first time since he'd walked into the hospital room, his voice carried genuine emotion. Scared of being a father, scared of the responsibility, scared of changing everything about our lives. Jessica made me feel like I was still the man I used to be, before mortgages and baby cribs and all of this adult stuff. So you ran, Maya said bluntly. Instead of talking to your wife about your fears, instead of getting counseling, instead of acting like a grown man, you ran straight into another woman's bed. Marcel looked at Emma sleeping in her carrier, his face crumpling with what looked like genuine anguish. I want to be part of her life. She's my daughter, too. Your daughter, Rose said slowly, nearly lost her mother because you were too busy, celebrating your last night of freedom to answer your phone when she was being born. Your daughter will grow up knowing that her father prioritized another woman over witnessing her first breath. The divorce proceedings began 2 weeks later, and Rose's attorney, Sarah Chen, was everything Marcel's smooth corporate lawyer wasn't: sharp, ruthless, and utterly devoted to protecting her client's interests. The evidence Rose had compiled was damning: credit card records, hotel receipts, photographs from Jessica's social media accounts, and witness testimony from colleagues who had suspected the affair for months. Your husband was sloppy, Sarah told Rose during their first meeting. Arrogant men usually are. He didn't even try to hide it toward the end. The discovery phase revealed the full scope of Marcel's deception. The affair had begun 14 months before Emma's birth, starting with late-night drinks after work and escalating to weekend getaways that Marcel had hidden behind fabricated business trips. He'd used their joint credit card to pay for dinners, hotels, and gifts for Jessica, essentially forcing Rose to finance her own betrayal. Most damaging of all were the text messages Sarah's investigators had recovered from Marcel's phone records. Messages that revealed not just the physical affair, but the emotional betrayal that cut even deeper. I can't wait until this baby comes so we can be together properly. Rose is so focused on the pregnancy, she doesn't even notice when I'm gone. Sometimes I wish I'd never gotten married. You make me remember who I really am. Marcel's lawyer tried to paint the affair as a momentary lapse in judgment, a mistake born of pre-fatherhood anxiety that had nothing to do with his love for Rose. But Sarah had ammunition that demolished that narrative completely. We're calling Jessica Crawford as a witness, Sarah told Rose before the final hearing. Her testimony is going to destroy any sympathy the judge might have for your husband. Jessica took the stand, wearing a conservative dress that did nothing to hide her obvious discomfort at being in a courtroom. Her affair with Marcel had cost her job when HR discovered the relationship, and she clearly resented being dragged into the public dissolution of his marriage. Miss Crawford, Sarah began, how long were you involved in a romantic relationship? With Marcel Smith. About 14 months, Jessica answered, her voice barely audible. And during this 14-month period, was Mr. Smith living with his pregnant wife? Yes. Did Mr. Smith ever express to you his feelings about his marriage? Jessica's eyes darted to Marcel, who was staring at the table in front of him, as if he could disappear into the wood grain. He He said he felt trapped, that he'd only married Rose because she got pregnant, not because he really loved her. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Rose felt the words hit her like physical blows, each syllable destroying another piece of the woman she'd been. Maya grabbed her hand, squeezing tight, but Rose barely felt it. "Did Mr. Smith say anything else about his feelings toward his wife?" Sarah continued, relentless in her pursuit of the truth. "He said—" Jessica paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "For the first time. He said he never really loved her, that she was a good person, but she wasn't the person he wanted to spend his life with. He said once the baby was born, he was planning to ask for a divorce so we could be together." The lie hung in the air like poison gas. Rose knew Marcel had loved her once. She'd felt it in his touch, seen it in his eyes, heard it in his voice during their private moments. But Jessica's testimony painted a picture of a man who had been planning to destroy his family from the moment he'd started his affair. Marcel's head shot up at Jessica's words, his face stricken with horror. "That's not true," he said loudly, causing the judge to bang his gavel for order. "I never said that. I never planned to leave Rose." But the damage was done. Judge Harrison, a stern man in his 60s who had presided over thousands of divorce cases, looked at Marcel with undisguised disgust. "Mr. Smith," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I have rarely seen such a callous disregard for the sanctity of marriage and the welfare of a child. You abandoned your wife during a medical emergency to conduct an affair that lasted over a year. Your actions directly contributed to the trauma your wife experienced during what should have been one of the most joyous occasions of your life." The judge's ruling was swift and brutal. Rose was awarded full physical custody of Emma, with Marcel granted only supervised visitation until Emma turned 18. Rose received the house, the majority of their assets, and substantial alimony payments that would ensure her financial security. Marcel's retirement accounts were split, his stock options were divided, and he was ordered to maintain life insurance with Emma as the beneficiary. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "Mr. Smith will pay all court costs and attorney fees for both parties. The court finds his behavior so egregious that he bears full financial responsibility for the dissolution of this marriage." When the gavel fell, Marcel broke completely. The composed businessman who had walked into the courtroom dissolved into a sobbing mess, his face buried in his hands as the magnitude of what he'd lost crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Rose, please!" he cried out as she gathered her things. "To leave. Please, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Don't take Emma away from me, don't take my family away." Rose looked at him one last time. This man who had promised to love and cherish her, who had created a beautiful daughter with her, who had destroyed everything good in their lives for the fleeting pleasure of an affair he'd now lost anyway. "You took your family away the night you chose another woman over being present for your daughter's birth," she said quietly. "I'm just making it official." As Rose walked out of the courthouse with Emma in her arms and her family surrounding her, she could still hear Marcel sobbing behind her. The sound followed her to the parking lot, a broken man's lament for the life he'd thrown away. But Rose didn't look back. She couldn't afford to look back anymore. Chapter 4. Rock Bottom and Rebuilding. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Marcel Smith found himself living in his BMW in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart, showering at a truck stop gym, and wondering how his life had unraveled so completely. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was sleeping in the same car he'd used to drive to countless hotels for his affair with Jessica. The luxury vehicle now served as a mobile prison that reminded him daily of his failures. The scandal had destroyed his career, starting with his termination from Henderson Marketing Group, The company maintained a strict morality clause in their employment contracts, and Marcel's very public divorce proceedings had transformed him from an asset into a liability they couldn't afford to keep. His boss, Richard Henderson, had called him into the office 3 days after the court ruling. "Marcel, you're a talented marketer," Henderson had said, not meeting his eyes across the mahogany desk. "But this situation has become untenable. Our clients are asking questions, and frankly, the way you handled your personal life raises serious questions about your judgment and integrity." "Mr. Henderson, please," Marcel had begged, desperation making his voice crack. "I can't afford to lose this job. I have alimony payments, child support." "You should have thought about that before. You destroyed your family," Richard replied coldly. "Clear out your desk by 5 o'clock. Security will escort you out." The job market had been brutal for a man whose professional reputation was now inextricably linked to his personal failures. Marcel's LinkedIn profile might have showcased his marketing achievements, but a simple Google search revealed the sordid details of his divorce, complete with newspaper articles detailing his affair and abandonment of his wife during childbirth. Interview after interview ended the same way. Polite rejections that cited cultural fit concerns or references that didn't align with company values. Jessica had abandoned him even faster than his employer had. She'd been at his apartment. When he returned from being fired, packing her belongings with the efficiency of someone who had been planning her exit strategy for weeks. "This isn't what I signed up for," she'd said, not even looking at him as she folded clothes into designer suitcases that Marcel had bought her during their affair. "I thought you were going to leave Rose and we'd be together properly. I didn't sign up to be the other woman in some trashy divorce scandal." "But I did leave Rose," Marcel had protested, watching his affair partner, his supposed love pack, up their shared delusions. "I lost everything for you, for us." Jessica had laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. "You didn't leave Rose for me, Marcel. You got caught. There's a difference." She'd paused at the door, her suitcases in hand, and delivered the final blow. "Besides, Brad wants to get back together. He's got a real job, real prospects. He's not pathetic." Brad, Jessica's ex-boyfriend, the one she'd claimed to be over when their affair began. The man she'd described as boring and unambitious was suddenly preferable to Marcel, who had sacrificed his family, his reputation, and his career for the privilege of sleeping with her. The apartment had been next to go. Without his job, Marcel couldn't afford the rent on the upscale downtown loft that had been his bachelor pad during the divorce proceedings. He'd bounced between cheap motels for a few weeks until even those became unaffordable. His savings, already depleted by legal fees and the judge's financial ruling, evaporated completely. Rock bottom had a specific smell, Marcel discovered. Stale coffee, unwashed clothes, and the particular brand of despair that came from checking your bank account and seeing numbers that wouldn't cover a value meal at McDonald's. He'd been living in his car for 2 weeks when he saw Rose's Instagram post that shattered what remained of his ego. The photograph showed Rose at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for Frank Marketing Solutions' new office space. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or professional styling, and everything to do with a woman who had transformed devastating betrayal into entrepreneurial triumph. The caption read, "Frank Marketing Solutions officially opens our doors today. Grateful to every client who believed in me when I took this leap of faith. Here's to building something beautiful from the ashes. In su entrepreneur life. New beginnings. Stronger together." The comments were filled with congratulations from friends, family, and business contacts. People calling her inspiring, brave, a role model for single mothers everywhere. Marcel scrolled through them with morbid fascination, watching his ex-wife being celebrated for surviving what he had done to her. There were photos of Emma too, now 6 months old, chubby and smiling. clearly thriving in her mother's care. She was sitting up on her own, reaching for toys with chubby fingers, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. Marcel stared at the photos until his vision blurred with tears, trying to memorize every detail of the daughter he was, allowed to see for 4 hours every other Sunday under the watchful eye of a court-appointed supervisor. The supervised visitations were perhaps the most humiliating aspect of his new reality. Marcel had to meet Emma at a sterile community center room, watched by a social worker named Mrs. Patterson, who took notes on every interaction. Emma, now old enough to be wary of strangers, would cry when Marcel tried to hold her, reaching for the social worker or asking for "mama" in the babbling way of babies learning to speak. "She doesn't know you," Mrs. Patterson had explained after one particularly difficult visit, where Emma had screamed for 30 minutes straight. "You're essentially a stranger to her. Building trust with infants takes time and consistency." Time and consistency, two things Marcel's choices had stolen from his relationship with his daughter. It was after one of these visits, sitting in his car in the community center parking lot, while Emma's cries still echoed in his ears, that Marcel finally admitted he needed help. He'd been drinking more heavily since losing his job, using alcohol to numb the constant ache of everything he'd lost. The bottle of whiskey hidden under his car seat had become his most constant companion, more reliable than Jessica had ever been, more comforting than the empty apartment he could no longer afford. But watching Emma recoil from him in fear had been a wake-up call. He was in danger of losing even the pathetic few hours he was allowed with his daughter. If Mrs. Patterson reported that he'd been drinking during visitation, the judge would terminate even his supervised access. Emma would grow up not just without her father present, but without any memory of him at all. Marcel's first AA meeting was held in the basement of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, a circle of folding chairs occupied by people who looked as broken as he felt. The coffee was terrible, the cookies were stale, and the fluorescent lights made everyone look sickly, but it was the first place in months where Marcel felt like he might not be judged for his failures. "Hi, I'm Marcel," he said when it was his turn to share, "and I'm an alcoholic." The words felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd never learned. But admitting his addiction was easier than admitting the rest of it, that he was also a cheater, a liar, a man who had abandoned his wife during the most dangerous night of her life for the fleeting pleasure of an affair that had meant nothing to either party involved. "I lost my family," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost my wife, my daughter, my job, everything that mattered to me. And I lost it all because I was too selfish and too scared to be the man they needed me to be." The group listened without judgment, these strangers who understood the particular shame of watching alcohol destroy everything good in your life. After the meeting, an older man named Frank approached Marcel. "How long you been drinking to avoid your problems?" "Son?" Frank asked, his weathered face kind but knowing. "I don't know," Marcel admitted. "Maybe since before Emma was born, maybe longer. I was so scared of being a father, of being responsible for someone else's life." Frank nodded. "Fear's a hell of a thing. Makes us do stupid stuff, run from the very things we should be running toward. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It's solid. You can build on it if you're willing to do the work." Marcel started therapy the following week with Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a no-nonsense counselor who specialized in addiction and relationship trauma. She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy absolution. Instead, she forced Marcel to confront the uncomfortable truths about his behavior, his choices, and the man he'd become. "You keep talking about being scared of fatherhood," Dr. Rodriguez said during their third session, "but I think you were more scared of growing up. The affair wasn't about Jessica. It was about trying to stay the person you were before you had real responsibilities." "Maybe," Marcel admitted. Jessica made me feel like I was still young, still free, like I could have everything without sacrificing anything. But that's not how life works, Dr. Rodriguez replied. Growing up means making choices, accepting responsibilities, sometimes giving up things you want for things that matter more. You wanted to be a husband and father without actually becoming a husband and father. The sessions were painful, forcing Marcel to examine not just his actions, but the selfishness and immaturity that had driven them. He began to understand that his betrayal of Rose had started long before he'd slept with Jessica. It had started the moment he'd decided that his fears were more important than his family's needs. Slowly, painfully, Marcel began to rebuild. He got a job at a small marketing firm, making a fraction of what he'd earned before, but enough to rent a studio apartment and stop living in his car. He attended AA meetings religiously, worked the 12 steps with a sponsor who didn't let him off easy, and continued therapy even when the sessions left him emotionally drained. The supervised visits with Emma gradually improved as Marcel learned to be patient, to let his daughter set the pace of their relationship. He brought age-appropriate toys, sang simple songs, and slowly began to earn tiny smiles from the little girl, who was growing more beautiful and intelligent each week. But the hardest part of Marcel's rebuilding wasn't the practical aspects: finding work, finding housing, staying sober. The hardest part was living with the knowledge of what he'd destroyed and accepting that some things, once broken, could never be fully repaired. He followed Rose's social media from a distance, watching her business flourish, watching Emma grow, watching the woman he'd loved create a beautiful life that no longer had room for him in it. It was torture, but it was also motivation, a constant reminder of what love looked like when it was cherished instead of betrayed. Marcel was learning to become the man he should have been all along. The question was whether it was too late to matter. Chapter 5. The first glimpse of hope. 2 years had transformed both Rose and Marcel in ways neither could have predicted during those dark early months. Emma's second birthday party was being held in Rose's backyard, the same space where Rose had once envisioned hosting family barbecues and watching their daughter take her first steps. The irony wasn't lost on Marcel that he now attended celebrations in what had once been his home as a carefully managed guest rather than the man of the house. The restraining order had been lifted 6 months ago when Marcel had successfully completed his court-mandated therapy and anger management classes. His supervised visits had gradually transitioned to unsupervised time, though he was still limited to 4 hours every other Sunday. It wasn't much, but it was progress, more than he dared hope for during those first desperate months of living. In his car, Marcel arrived at the party carrying a carefully wrapped gift, a wooden toy kitchen set he'd spent weeks researching to make sure it was age-appropriate and safe. His appearance had changed dramatically over the past 2 years. The expensive suits had been replaced by clean jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He was thinner now, his face showing the stress lines of someone who'd lost everything and was slowly, painstakingly trying to rebuild. But his eyes were clearer than they'd been in years. The hazy fog of alcohol and self-deception finally lifted. Rose greeted him at the back gate with polite courtesy, the kind of careful friendliness reserved for acquaintances rather than former lovers. She looked radiant. Her business was thriving and success agreed with her. Her hair was styled in a way that showed off her graceful neck, and she wore a sundress that complemented her glowing skin. But it was the man standing beside her that made Marcel's stomach clench with a mixture of jealousy and resignation. Dr. David Hamilton was everything Marcel wasn't. Tall, distinguished, clearly successful, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from saving children's lives for a living rather than destroying families through selfishness. His hand rested casually on Rose's lower back in a gesture that spoke of intimacy and claim. And when he looked at her, his face softened with obvious adoration. "Marcel," Rose said, her voice neutral but not unfriendly, "you remember David?" "Of course," Marcel replied, extending his hand to the man who was clearly his replacement in every way that mattered. "Good to see you again." David's handshake was firm, his smile genuine but measuring. Marcel could see the doctor evaluating him, trying to determine if he posed any threat to the life David was building with Rose and Emma. It was a fair assessment. Marcel would have done the same thing in his position. "Emma's been looking forward to seeing you," Rose said, and Marcel's heart lifted at the words. His relationship with his daughter had slowly, carefully improved over the past year. Emma no longer cried when she saw him, no longer clung to strangers rather than accept his touch. She was beginning to recognize him as someone safe, someone who belonged in her world, even if his role in it was limited. Emma was holding court in the center of the backyard, surrounded by colorful balloons and presents, wearing a frilly pink dress that made her look like a miniature princess. At 2 years old, she was walking confidently, chattering in the half-sentences that toddlers used to communicate their urgent thoughts about the world. When she saw Marcel, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Daddy!" she squealed, running toward him with the unsteady gait of a child still mastering the art of locomotion. Marcel caught her in his arms, lifting her up and spinning her around while she giggled with delight. The sound was like music to his ears, pure joy from the little person he'd helped create but barely knew. For a moment, the careful boundaries and supervised visits disappeared, and Marcel felt like a real father rather than a stranger trying to earn his daughter's trust. "Happy birthday, Princess," Marcel said, kissing Emma's cheek. "Daddy brought you a special present." Emma clapped her hands excitedly, her dark eyes, so much like Rose's, bright with anticipation. Marcel set her down and presented the wrapped gift, watching with parental pride as she attacked the colorful paper with the focused intensity that only children could bring to the task of unwrapping presents. The party continued around them, a carefully orchestrated celebration that included Rose's family, some of her business associates, and a few other parents with children Emma's age. Marcel stayed on the periphery, grateful to be included, but aware that he was more tolerated than welcomed by most of the guests. Maya still watched him with barely concealed suspicion, and Rose's parents treated him with the icy politeness reserved for people who had hurt their daughter beyond forgiveness. But Emma seemed genuinely happy to see him, and that was enough. She brought him her toys to admire, insisted he push her on the swing set that David had installed, another reminder of the life Marcel should have been building, and even shared her birthday cake with him, offering him bites with sticky fingers and chocolate-smeared smiles. Marcel found himself watching Rose and David together with the fascination of someone observing a life he might have had if he'd made different choices. David was attentive without being hovering, helpful without being intrusive, charming with the other guests, while keeping Rose at the center of his attention. He was, Marcel realized with painful clarity, the kind of man Rose deserved. Stable, present, emotionally available in ways Marcel had never learned to be. "He's good with her," Marcel said to Maya when she approached him near the refreshment table. It was the first time Rose's sister had spoken to him directly in 2 years. Maya followed his gaze to where David was helping Emma navigate the slide on her new playground equipment. "He is," she agreed, her tone neutral. "He's been good for both of them." "I'm glad," Marcel said, and surprised himself by meaning it. "Rose deserves to be happy." Maya studied him with the same evaluating look he'd been getting all afternoon. "You look different," she said finally. "Healthier." "I feel different," Marcel admitted. "Sober. Like I'm seeing things clearly for the first time in years." "Good," Maya said simply. Emma needs her father to be healthy, even if he can't be her mother's husband. It was perhaps the kindest thing any member of Rose's family had said to him since the divorce, and Marcel felt a spark of hope that maybe, eventually, he could earn back some measure of respect from the people whose good opinion mattered to his daughter. The moment that changed everything happened when Emma was playing on her new slide. She was climbing the ladder with the determined concentration of a 2-year-old who had decided this was the most important task in the world. Marcel was watching from across the yard, chatting with one of the other fathers about toddler-proofing strategies, when Emma missed a step near the top of the slide. She fell backward, her small body tumbling through the air with the sickening inevitability of gravity, and landed hard on the grass below. For a moment, there was complete silence that held breath of every parent's worst nightmare. Then Emma began to scream, the piercing wail of a child who was both hurt and terrified. Rose reached her first, but Marcel wasn't far behind, both parents dropping to their knees beside their crying daughter. Emma's wrist was bent at an odd angle, and there was a scrape on her forehead that was bleeding more dramatically than it was serious. But Marcel could see in Rose's face the same panic he felt clawing at his own chest. "Don't move her," David said, his medical training taking over. As he knelt beside them, "Let me check for obvious injuries before we pick her up." But Emma was having none of it. She was crying for her parents, reaching for both Rose and Marcel with the desperate need of a hurt child for comfort. Without thinking, Marcel scooped her up gently, cradling her against his chest, while Rose supported her injured arm. "Shh, baby." "Oh, girl," Marcel murmured, his voice soft and soothing in a way that surprised even him. "Daddy's got you. Mama's here. You're going to be okay." Something magical happened then. Emma's cries began to subside as Marcel rocked her gently, his familiar voice and the solid comfort of his chest providing the security she needed. Rose moved closer, her hand on Emma's back, and for a moment they formed a protective circle around their daughter, not as ex-spouses or former lovers, but simply as parents united in their love for their child. "We should get her to the emergency room," David said practically. "That wrist needs to be x-rayed." Marcel looked at Rose, a question in his eyes. For a brief moment, he saw not the woman he'd betrayed and lost, but the mother of his child, who was just as scared as he was. "I'll drive," Rose said, and Marcel understood that she was offering him something precious, the chance to be present for Emma's crisis, to be a real father in this moment of need. At St. Mary's Hospital, as they waited for Emma's x-rays, Marcel found himself in the strange position of trying to comfort his ex-wife while she worried about their daughter. Emma had calmed down significantly once her wrist was properly splinted, but Rose was still shaky from the scare. "She's going to be fine," Marcel said quietly, his hand hovering near Rose's shoulder before he thought better of the gesture. "Kids are resilient. She'll probably forget about this by next week." Rose looked at him then, really looked at him, for the first time in 2 years. She seemed to be taking inventory of the changes, the sober clarity in his eyes, the way he'd handled Emma's accident without panic, the gentleness in his voice when he'd comforted their daughter. "You were good with her today," Rose said finally. "When she got hurt, you knew exactly what to do." "She's my daughter," Marcel replied simply. "I may have missed too much of her life already, but I'm not going to miss any more opportunities to be her father." Emma emerged from radiology with a bright pink cast and a lollipop, already chattering excitedly about her special arm to anyone who would listen. As they prepared to leave the hospital, she reached for both her parents, wanting to be carried by both of them at once. "Up, Daddy! Up, Mama!" she demanded. And for a moment, as Marcel and Rose each took one of Emma's hands and walked toward the parking lot together, they looked like what they'd once been, a family. It was just a moment, and Marcel knew better than to read too much into it. Rose was with David now, building a new life that didn't include room for the man who had destroyed their marriage. But as Marcel strapped Emma into her car seat and kissed her forehead goodbye, he allowed himself to hope that maybe someday he could earn back the right to be more than just a visitor in his daughter's life. And maybe, if he continued to prove himself worthy of trust, Rose might eventually see him as something more than just the man who had broken her heart. Chapter 6. The First Apology. Rejected. Marcel Smith sat at his small kitchen table in the modest apartment that had become his entire world. The contrast to the sprawling house he'd once shared with Rose was stark. Gone were the granite countertops and designer furniture, replaced by second-hand pieces from estate sales that barely filled the space. But tonight, material possessions didn't matter. Tonight, he was going to do what he should have done 2 years ago. Tell Rose the complete, unvarnished truth about everything. The blank pages stared back at him, waiting. He'd started this letter a dozen times over the past 6 months, each attempt ending up crumpled in the trash. But watching Emma at her second birthday party 3 weeks ago, seeing the way Rose's eyes had softened for just a moment when he'd comforted their daughter at the hospital had given him hope. Maybe, just maybe, Rose could find it in her heart to listen. Marcel picked up his pen and began to write. My dearest Rose, I know I have no right to call you that anymore. I know I forfeited that privilege the night I chose a bottle of champagne and another woman's bed over being there when you nearly died, bringing our daughter into this world. But I'm writing this letter not because I expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but because you deserve to know the truth about everything, all of it. The words flowed like a confession, each sentence a small piece of his soul laid bare on the paper. Marcel wrote about the affair with Jessica, how it had started not out of love or even lust, but out of his own pathetic insecurity. He wrote about how Jessica had made him feel important, successful, desired, all the things he'd been too immature to realize he already had with Rose. The affair began 14 months before Emma was born. I was scared, Rose, terrified of becoming a father, of the responsibility of not being good enough for you or our baby. Instead of talking to you about my fears, I ran to someone who made me feel like the man I thought I wanted to be, instead of growing into the man you needed me to be. He detailed every lie he'd told, every secret meeting, every moment he'd looked Rose in the eye and deceived her while she carried their child. The luxury resort weekend hadn't been a spontaneous celebration. It had been planned for weeks, a deliberate choice to escape the reality of his impending fatherhood. When your sister Maya called me that night to tell me you were in labor, I was drunk. Not just tipsy, Rose, drunk. And instead of rushing to your side like any decent husband would have done, I turned off my phone. I actually turned it off because I didn't want my last night of freedom to be interrupted. I danced with Jessica while you hemorrhaged. I laughed while you cried for me. I slept peacefully in another woman's arms while you fought for your life alone. Marcel's hand trembled as he wrote those words. Even now, 2 years later, the magnitude of his betrayal felt too enormous to comprehend. How could he have been so selfish, so completely blind to what he was destroying? I want you to know that Jessica meant nothing to me. Not in the way that you think might make it better, but in the way that makes it so much worse. I didn't throw away our marriage for a great love affair. I threw it away for nothing, for ego, for cowardice, for the delusion that I could have. Everything without earning any of it. Page after page, Marcel laid out his sins. He wrote about the Christmas party where Rose had admired Jessica's bracelet, the same bracelet he'd bought for his mistress with money from their joint account. He wrote about the baby shower where Jessica had smiled in Rose's face while knowing she was sleeping with Rose's husband. He wrote about every moment of duplicity, every instance where he'd chosen to prioritize his own wants over his wife's needs. The night Emma was born should have been the most beautiful night of our lives. Instead, it became the worst because of choices I made. Not circumstances beyond my control, not misunderstandings. Choices. I chose to betray you. I chose to abandon you. I chose to miss the birth of our daughter because I was too selfish and too cowardly to face my responsibilities. Marcel wrote about the aftermath too, how he'd arrived at the hospital still smelling of Jessica's perfume, how he'd tried to lie his way out of the truth even as the evidence was plastered all over social media. He wrote about the divorce proceedings, about sitting in that courtroom and listening to Jessica testify that he'd told her he'd never really loved Rose. That was the biggest lie of all, Rose. I've loved you since the moment I met you at your cousin's wedding, when you laughed so hard at the best man's speech that you snorted champagne through your nose. I loved you when you used to sing off-key in the shower every morning. I loved you when you cried at dog videos on the internet. I loved you when you glowed with pregnancy, talking to Emma through your belly every night. I love you now, even though I have no right to. The problem was never that I didn't love you. The problem was that I didn't love myself enough to believe I deserved you. He wrote about the 2 years since the divorce, about losing his job and living in his car, about Jessica leaving him for someone else the moment his life fell apart. He wrote about the AA meetings and therapy sessions, about slowly learning to face the man he'd become and working to build someone better from the ashes. I'm not writing this letter to ask you to take me back. I'm not writing it to ease my own guilt. I'm writing it because I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you. I understand that I didn't just cheat on you. I abandoned you when you needed me most. I understand that every single day you have to live with the memory of that night, of giving birth to our daughter while wondering where your husband was, of nearly dying while I was celebrating. I understand that I not only broke your heart, I broke your ability to trust, to feel safe, to believe that the person who promises to love you through everything actually means it. Marcel reached for his checkbook and wrote out a check for $50,000, every penny he'd managed, to save in the past 2 years of rebuilding his life. He'd planned to use it as a down payment on a house, maybe something nice enough that Emma could have her own room when she visited. But this was more important. I'm including a check for Emma's college fund. It's not enough. Nothing could ever be enough, but it's everything I have. I want her to know that even though I failed her mother, I will never stop trying to be the father she deserves. The letter stretched to 20 pages by the time Marcel finished. His hand ached, his eyes were dry from crying, and his heart felt both empty and strangely lighter. He'd told the truth, all of it. Finally, he sealed the letter and checked in an envelope, writing Rose's name across the front in his careful handwriting. Then he drove across town to the beautiful house Rose had bought after the divorce, the house that should have been theirs, where Emma took her first steps and said her first words without him there to witness it. Marcel left the envelope in the mailbox and drove away without looking back. 3 days later, his phone rang. Rose's number appeared on the screen, and for a moment Marcel's heart soared with hope. "Your words mean nothing to me, Marcel." Rose's voice was ice-cold, cutting through his hope like a blade. "You had your chance to be a husband when I was bleeding on that operating table. You had your chance to be a father when Emma was born. You had your chance to be a man when I needed you most." Marcel closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "Rose, keep your money," she continued, her voice never wavering. "We don't need your guilt payments. Emma and I have built a beautiful life without you, and your $50,000 won't buy you a place in it. Don't contact me again unless it's about Emma's scheduled visits." The line went dead. Marcel sat in his empty apartment staring at The phone, feeling the weight of his failures pressing down on him like a physical force. Rose was right. His words meant nothing. His money meant nothing. But Emma. Emma meant everything, and he would keep trying to become the father she deserved, even if her mother would never forgive him. Chapter 7. The Crisis That Changes Everything. The call came on a Tuesday morning. While Marcel was reviewing quarterly reports at Pinnacle Consulting, the mid-sized firm where he'd slowly rebuilt his professional reputation. He'd climbed from entry-level data entry to junior analyst. Nothing glamorous, but honest work that paid his bills and demonstrated he could be trusted with responsibility again. When Rose's name appeared on his phone screen, his heart immediately clenched with worry. She never called him directly anymore, not since the letter incident 6 months ago. Marcel? Rose's voice was different, smaller, frightened in a way. He hadn't heard since the night Emma was born. What's wrong? Is Emma okay? Emma's fine. Rose took a shaky breath. It's my mother. Marcel, she has cancer, pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The words hit Marcel like a physical blow. Dorothy Frank had been more than just his mother-in-law during their marriage. She'd been the mother he'd never had, the woman who'd taught him how to make her famous cornbread, who'd sat with him through football games explaining plays he didn't understand, who'd held him when his own father died and whispered that family meant showing up no matter what. Oh God, Rose, I'm so sorry. What can I do? How can I help? There was a long pause. Marcel could hear Rose crying softly, trying to compose herself. I can't. There's nothing anyone can do. The doctors say maybe 6 months if we're lucky. I just thought you should know because Emma loves her grandmother so much. And if you want to bring her to visit, of course, whatever you need, whatever Emma needs. I have to go. I'm at the hospital. The line went dead, leaving Marcel staring at his phone in his sterile office cubicle. Dorothy Frank, the woman who'd welcomed him into her family with open arms, who'd defended him to her church friends when he was just that white boy dating Rosie, who'd cried happy tears at their wedding, was dying, and Rose was facing it alone. That evening, Marcel drove to Dorothy's house where Rose had moved back after the divorce. Through the living room window, he could see Rose sitting at her mother's bedside, holding her hand, while Emma played quietly with coloring books on the floor. The scene was so intimate, so private, that Marcel felt like an intruder just watching from the street. But Dorothy had been family once. She'd made him family. Over the next few weeks, Marcel watched from a distance as Rose struggled to balance everything. Her successful marketing consultancy, which had been thriving, began to show cracks as Rose spent more and more time at the hospital. He saw the exhaustion in her face during Emma's weekend visits, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of being strong for everyone. So Marcel began to help in the only way Rose might accept, invisibly. It started small. He picked up Emma from daycare on days when Rose had to stay late at the hospital, even though it wasn't his scheduled time. When Rose protested, he simply said, Dorothy would want Emma to have dinner at a reasonable hour. And Rose couldn't argue with that logic. Then Marcel began staying after dropping Emma off, not inside the house, but in his car outside, just in case. One night, when Dorothy had a particularly bad episode, and Rose had to rush to the emergency room at 2 a.m., Marcel was there to take Emma to his apartment so she wouldn't have to see her grandmother in distress. Why are you doing this? Rose asked him the next morning when she came to collect Emma. She looked exhausted, her usually perfectly styled hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. Because it's what family does, Marcel said simply, and whether you like it or not, Emma is my family, which means her grandmother is my family, which means... He didn't finish the sentence, but Rose understood. She nodded curtly and took Emma home. As Dorothy's condition worsened, Marcel's help became more essential. He researched the best palliative care specialists, calling in favors from his insurance contacts to get Dorothy into programs Rose couldn't afford. He organized meal trains through Dorothy's church, coordinating with Rose's sisters and cousins to ensure there was always food in the house. When Rose's biggest client, Meridian Corporation, threatened to terminate their contract because Rose had missed 2 important deadlines, Marcel made a decision that would cost him nearly everything he'd saved. He anonymously contacted Meridian's CEO, a man Marcel had worked with years ago, and offered to cover the penalty fees if Meridian would give Rose another chance. "I don't understand," Rose told him weeks later, confusion evident in her voice. "Meridian not only renewed our contract, they increased it by 30%. They said they were impressed by my family values and wanted to support a business owner going through a difficult time." Marcel just nodded, not mentioning the $15,000 he'd paid or the personal guarantees he'd made. As autumn turned to winter, Dorothy's decline accelerated. She was moved to hospice care, and Rose barely left her side. Marcel took Emma most evenings, helping with homework he barely understood, and making dinner from recipes Dorothy had taught him years ago. "Daddy makes Grandma Dot's mac and cheese almost as good as she does," Emma told Rose one evening, and Marcel saw something flicker across Rose's face. Surprise, maybe even gratitude. One snowy December night, Marcel was reading Emma a bedtime story when Rose called. "She's asking for you," Rose said quietly. "Mom is asking for you." Marcel's hands shook as he arranged for his neighbor to watch Emma. He drove to the hospice through the snow, his heart pounding. He hadn't seen Dorothy since before the divorce, hadn't spoken to her since that terrible day in court when he'd lost everything. Dorothy Frank lay in the narrow hospital bed, smaller than Marcel remembered, but with eyes still bright with the intelligence and warmth that had always defined her. When she saw him, she smiled. That same welcoming smile she'd given him the first time Rose brought him home for Sunday dinner. "Marcel, baby," she whispered, her voice weak but still carrying that tone of maternal affection that had meant everything to him. "Come here." Marcel approached the bed carefully, aware that Rose was watching from the corner chair. Dorothy reached out her thin hand, and Marcel took it gently. "I need to tell you something," Dorothy said. "I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, not even after everything. You were my son for 3 years, and that doesn't just disappear because of mistakes." Marcel's vision blurred with tears. "Dorothy, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for what I did to Rose, to Emma, to you. I'm sorry for—" "Hush now!" Dorothy squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "I know you're sorry. I can see it in everything you've been doing these past months. Taking care of Emma, helping Rose, even when she didn't know it was you. That's the Marcel I remember. That's the man I always knew you could be." She turned her head slightly to look at Rose. "And you, baby girl, I know you're hurt. Lord knows you have every right to be. But don't let your pain make you blind to the good that's still in this man. He's showing up now, Rose. He's been showing up." Rose's breath caught, and Marcel saw tears streaming down her face. Dorothy looked back at Marcel. "Promise me something. Promise me you'll keep showing up. Not for Rose, she's strong enough to handle anything, but for Emma. Promise me that little girl will always have her daddy in her life." "I promise," Marcel whispered. "I swear to you, Dorothy, I'll never disappear from Emma's life again." Dorothy smiled and closed her eyes. "Good, that's all I needed to hear." 2 days later, Dorothy Frank passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Rose holding one hand and Marcel holding the other. At the funeral home, as families came to pay their respects, Marcel stood quietly in the back, not wanting to intrude on Rose's grief. But when Rose's cousin asked who had organized all the beautiful flowers, the catered meal for after the service, the transportation for elderly relatives, Rose looked across the room at Marcel. Their eyes met for the first time. In months, without anger or resentment, just understanding. Marcel had been there. Through all of it, he had been there. Not as her husband, not even as her friend, but as someone who had loved Dorothy Frank and who understood that family meant showing up, no matter what. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was recognition. And for Marcel, it was enough to keep hoping. Chapter 8. The Second Apology. A Crack in the Wall. The morning of Dorothy Frank's funeral dawned grey and bitterly cold, as if the January sky itself mourned the loss of one of the kindest souls to ever grace this earth. Marcel stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his black tie for the third time, his hands trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of what this day represented. Dorothy had been more than just his former mother-in-law. She had been his anchor, the woman who had seen past his flaws and loved him unconditionally when his own family had turned away. And now he had to say goodbye to her while navigating the complicated grief of the woman she'd left behind. The woman he'd hurt so deeply that even death couldn't fully bridge the chasm between them. Marcel arrived at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, early, not wanting to cause any disruption or awkwardness for Rose on what was already the worst day of her life. The church was the same one where he and Rose had been married 4 years ago, where Dorothy had insisted they hold the ceremony, even though Rose had wanted something smaller and more secular. Looking at the familiar stained glass windows and wooden pews, Marcel could almost hear Dorothy's voice. "A marriage needs God's blessing and community witness, baby. Trust me on this." The church filled quickly with mourners. Dorothy had touched countless lives during her 68 years. Marcel took a seat in the very back, wanting to be present without intruding on the family's grief. But as the service began, he was surprised when the funeral director approached him. "Excuse me, Mr. Smith." Mrs. Frank specifically requested that. "You give a eulogy. She left instructions with her lawyer." The man handed Marcel a sealed envelope with his name written in Dorothy's careful handwriting. Marcel's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside was a brief note in Dorothy's familiar script. "Marcel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in the back of the church feeling like you don't belong. But you do belong, baby. You belong because I loved you like a son. And love doesn't die just because people make mistakes. Please tell everyone who I was, not just as Rose's mother, but as the woman who believed in second chances and the power of forgiveness. Make them understand that showing up matters more than being perfect. With all my love, Dorothy." Marcel felt tears streaming down his face as he read her final words to him. Even in death, Dorothy was still trying to heal the wounds his choices had created. When it came time for the eulogies, Marcel walked slowly to the front of the church, aware of the surprised murmurs from the congregation. Rose looked up from the front pew, her face a mask of composed grief, but he saw something flicker in her eyes, not anger, but curiosity. Marcel cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of faces, all waiting to hear what the man who had broken Dorothy's daughter's heart could possibly say about the woman they'd all loved. "Dorothy Frank," he began, his voice stronger than he felt, "was the first person to teach me what unconditional love actually looked like. Not the kind of love that overlooks your flaws, but the kind that sees them clearly and loves you anyway, and then challenges you to become better." He spoke about the first time he'd met Dorothy, how nervous he'd been to meet Rose's family, how Dorothy had taken one look at him and declared, "Well, you're skinny as a rail, but you've got kind eyes. Come on in here and let me feed you." He talked about how she'd patiently taught him to make her famous cornbread, laughing when he burned the first 3 batches, but never giving up on him. "Dorothy used to tell me that family wasn't about being perfect," Marcel continued, his voice growing more emotional. "She said family was about showing up when times are good, Showing up when times are bad, and most importantly, showing up when you've messed up and need to make things right. Marcel's eyes found Rose in the front pew. She was crying now, her carefully composed facade cracking as his words washed over her. "I failed at that for a while," Marcel said, his voice breaking slightly. "I failed to show up when Rose needed me most. I failed to show up for Emma's birth. I failed to be the man Dorothy raised me to be. But Dorothy never gave up on me, even when she had every right to, even when I had given up on myself." He talked about the past few months, about Dorothy's illness, and how she had faced it with dignity and grace. He spoke about her love for Emma, how her face had lit up every time their granddaughter walked into the room. He talked about her faith, her kindness to strangers, her legendary Sunday dinners that could bring together the most disparate group of people. Dorothy Frank believed in redemption, Marcel concluded, looking directly at Rose now. She believed that people could change, that mistakes didn't define you, that love was always stronger than hurt if you were brave enough to let it be. She taught me that real men don't run from their responsibilities. They face them, they own them, and they spend every day trying to become worthy of the love they've been given. Marcel paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I'll never be worthy of the love Dorothy gave me. I know I lost the right to call her family when I betrayed her daughter. But I want everyone here to know that Dorothy Frank saved my life by showing me what love looked like when it was freely given and fiercely protective. She made me want to be better, not for what I could get, but for what I could give." He stepped down from the podium to complete silence. Then slowly, from the back of the church, came the sound of clapping. It spread through the congregation like a wave, not the polite applause of social obligation, but the genuine appreciation of people who had been moved by truth. After the service, as mourners gathered at Dorothy's house for the traditional meal, Marcel kept to himself in the backyard, needing air and space to process his emotions. The house was full of Dorothy's presence, her photographs on every surface, her handmade quilts draped over chairs, the scent of her lavender candles still lingering in the air. He was standing by Dorothy's prize-winning rose garden when he heard the back door open. Rose appeared, still in her black dress, but having removed her heels, her feet bare despite the cold ground. "She would have loved that eulogy," Rose said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "She always said you had a way with words when you bothered to use them honestly." Marcel nodded, not trusting his voice. "I found something," Rose continued, pulling out a small wrapped package. "She left it for you." Inside was Dorothy's favorite coffee mug, the one she'd used every morning for as long as Marcel had known her. It was chipped and faded, but she'd refused to replace it because, as she'd always said, some things get more precious with age and wear. Wrapped around the mug was a note for Marcel. "So you'll remember that even broken things can still hold something warm. Love always, Dorothy." Marcel broke down then, the grief and guilt and love all crashing over him at once. He sank onto Dorothy's garden bench, clutching the mug, sobbing like the broken man he was. To his surprise, Rose sat down beside him. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that he could feel her warmth in the cold air. "Marcel," she said softly, and he looked up to see her own tears falling freely. "I know you loved her. I know she loved you. And I know you've been different these past few months, showing up for Emma, helping with Mom, even when you thought I didn't know it was you." Marcel wiped his eyes. "Rose, I am so sorry for everything. For that night, for the affair, for missing Emma's birth, for not being the husband you deserved, for not being the son-in-law your mother deserved. I'm sorry for all of it." Rose was quiet for a long moment, looking out at her mother's garden, where the rose bushes stood dormant, waiting for spring to bring them back to life. "I know you are," she said finally, and for the first time in 3 years. There was no anger in her voice, No coldness, just acknowledgement, just truth. They sat together in the grey afternoon, two broken people who had loved the same woman, both trying to figure out how to honor her memory, and maybe, possibly, find their way to something that looked like peace. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the first crack in the wall Rose had built around her heart, and for Marcel, it felt like the beginning of hope. Chapter 9. When Everything Falls Apart Again. 2 years had elapsed since Dorothy Frank's funeral, 2 years during which Rose and Marcel had cultivated an almost comfortable co-parenting relationship. Their interactions remained polite, even cordial, centered entirely around Emma's needs and development. Marcel had maintained perfect attendance at scheduled visits, never missed a child support payment, and had gradually earned back the privilege of attending school events and birthday celebrations without creating tension. Rose, meanwhile, had flourished in ways that both amazed and humbled Marcel. Her marketing consultancy had grown into a small empire, employing 12 people and serving clients across 3 states. She'd bought a beautiful colonial house in the best school district, learned to speak conversational Spanish, and had even started dating again. Dr. David Hamilton had entered their lives 3 years ago, a pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital, who was everything Marcel had never been: stable, dependable, present. David was the kind of man who brought flowers on first dates, who remembered to ask about Emma's school projects, who had proposed to Rose on Christmas morning with a ring that cost more than Marcel made in 6 months. The wedding was planned for June. Marcel had seen the engagement announcement in the local paper, had even attended the small party Rose threw to celebrate, standing awkwardly by the punch bowl while David's hand rested possessively on Rose's lower back. Emma seemed to like David well enough, though she'd confided to Marcel during one of their weekend visits that he's nice, but he's not really funny like you, Daddy. Marcel told himself he was happy for Rose. She deserved stability, deserved a man who would never let her down the way he had. If his heart still ached every time he saw her smile at David, the way she used to smile at him, well, that was just the price he paid for his choices. Everything changed on a Tuesday in March when Emma was 5 years old. Marcel was in a client meeting when his phone buzzed with a text from Rose. "Emma in accident. Rush hospital now." The words were so stark, so terrifying in their brevity, that Marcel's blood turned to ice. He excused himself from the meeting, grabbed his keys, and drove like a madman across town to St. Mary's Hospital. The emergency room was chaos. Doctors and nurses rushing between curtained areas, machines beeping incessantly, the smell of antiseptic, doing nothing to mask the underlying scent of fear and pain. Marcel found Rose in the waiting area, and the sight of her nearly brought him to his knees. She was still in her work clothes, but her perfectly pressed blouse was stained with blood. Emma's blood. Her hands shook as she clutched her purse, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that only a parent can know. When she saw Marcel, something in her composure cracked. She was crossing the street after school, Rose said, her voice hollow, with her friend Katie. The crossing guard said the light had just changed, they were in the crosswalk, and this drunk driver just plowed right through the intersection. "Katie's fine, just bruises, but Emma—" Rose's voice broke completely. Then, and without thinking, Marcel pulled her into his arms. For the first time in 5 years, Rose didn't pull away. She collapsed against his chest, sobbing with the raw, desperate grief of a mother who might lose her child. "She has internal bleeding," Rose whispered against his shirt, "and a traumatic brain injury. They don't know, Marcel, they don't know if she's going to—" "She will," Marcel said fiercely, holding Rose tighter. "She's strong. She's your daughter. She's our daughter. She's going to be fine." Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending physician, emerged from the trauma bay looking exhausted. "Mr. and Mrs. Smith." "We're divorced," Rose said automatically, stepping slightly away from Marcel, but not completely, out of his embrace. Emma's parents, Marcel clarified. Dr. Williams nodded gravely. Emma has significant internal injuries. We've managed to stop the bleeding, but she has a severe concussion and some brain swelling. We're going to need to monitor her very carefully over the next 72 hours. The next few days will be critical. The next 3 days and nights blurred together in a nightmare of waiting rooms and hospital corridors. Marcel and Rose took turns sitting by Emma's bedside, neither willing to leave their daughter alone, even for a moment. Emma looked so small in the hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and monitors, her usually bright face pale and still. Rose hadn't slept more than an hour at a time, refusing to go home even to shower or change clothes. Marcel brought her coffee and sandwiches she barely touched, sat with her during the long vigil, and held her when the fear became too much to bear alone. On the second night, as they sat in matching plastic chairs beside Emma's bed, Rose broke the silence. "Do you remember when she was born? How tiny she was?" Marcel's throat tightened. "I wasn't there." "No," Rose said quietly, "but you came later. When you finally held her for the first time, you cried. You were so afraid you'd drop her." "I was. Afraid of everything back then," Marcel admitted. "Afraid of being a father, afraid of being a husband, afraid of not being good enough. So I ran." Rose looked at him in the dim hospital light. "And now I'm still afraid," Marcel said honestly. "But I learned that running doesn't make the fear go away. It just makes everything worse." On the third morning, Emma's eyes fluttered. Open, both parents leaned forward instantly, hope and fear warring in their hearts. "Mommy." Emma's voice was weak, confused. "Daddy." "We're here, baby," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "We're both here." Emma looked between her parents with the innocent clarity that only children possess. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "Promise you won't leave me." "Never," Marcel said, taking one of Emma's small hands while Rose held the other. "We're not going anywhere." It was then that David arrived, having flown back early from a medical conference in Chicago. He stood in the doorway of Emma's room, taking in the scene. Rose and Marcel on either side of Emma's bed, their hands joined over their daughter's body, looking for all the world like a family reunited by crisis. Rose noticed him first. "David, you're back." "I came as soon as I got your message," David said, but his voice was strangely flat. He was looking at Rose's left hand, Marcel realized, at how naturally she'd reached for her ex-husband's comfort, how she'd allowed Marcel to hold her while she grieved. David stepped into the room and gently kissed Rose's forehead. "How is she?" "Better," Rose said. "The swelling has gone down, and she's been awake for almost an hour." David examined Emma with professional efficiency, speaking to her in the gentle, reassuring tone he used with his young patients. But Marcel noticed how his eyes kept returning to Rose, studying her face with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Later, while Emma napped and Rose had finally been convinced to go home for a shower and fresh clothes, David and Marcel found themselves alone in the hospital cafeteria. "She was never really mine, was she?" David said without preamble, stirring his coffee absently. Marcel looked up, surprised by the doctor's directness. "David, I've watched her for 2 years," David continued. "Watched her build this perfect life, this controlled existence where everything has its place and everyone has their role. I thought I was part of that life, thought she loved me the way I love her." David pulled out a small velvet box and set it on the table between them. Inside was the engagement ring Rose had been wearing for months, a beautiful solitaire that caught the fluorescent light and threw tiny rainbows across the white table. But these past 3 days, watching her fall apart and then watching you catch her, watching how you two move together like you're still connected by some invisible thread. David shook his head. "I realized I'd been trying to compete with a ghost." "You're a good man," Marcel said quietly. You've been good to her, good to Emma. Rose cares about you. She does, David agreed, but she loves you even after everything you did to her, even after all these years. She still loves you. And you love her. Marcel couldn't deny it. That doesn't mean anything. Love isn't enough. I proved that. Maybe not, David said, standing up and leaving the ring box on the table. But sometimes a second chance is exactly what love needs to become enough. When Rose returned to the hospital that evening, refreshed and wearing clean clothes for the first time in days, she found Marcel reading to Emma from her favorite book. The sight stopped her in the doorway, her daughter's face animated with interest, Marcel's voice gentle and expressive as he brought the characters to life. It wasn't until later, as they walked to the parking garage together, that Rose noticed her bare ring finger. "Rose," Marcel said carefully, "David came by earlier." Rose looked down at her hand, then at Marcel. Something passed between them, understanding, acknowledgement, the recognition of what had been lost and what might still be possible. "I know," she said simply, and for the first time in 5 years, they walked side by side into an uncertain future. Chapter 10. The Final Apology. Love Conquers All. 6 months had elapsed since Emma's accident, 6 months during which the carefully maintained boundaries between Rose and Marcel began to blur and shift like watercolors in rain. Emma's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. Her young brain had healed with the resilience that doctors called remarkable, but parents called answered prayers. By summer, she had returned to her spirited self, climbing trees with reckless abandon and asking endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether dinosaurs would have enjoyed ice cream. The accident had changed everything, and nothing all at once. Rose and Marcel still lived in separate houses, still maintained their careful co-parenting schedule, still treated each other with the polite distance of two people who shared a child, but not a life. But there were moments now, glances that lingered too long, accidental touches that neither pulled away from immediately, conversations that veered into dangerous territory before one of them remembered to retreat. David had left town quietly after returning the engagement ring, taking a position at Johns Hopkins that everyone agreed was too good an opportunity to pass up. He'd said his goodbyes with dignity and grace, kissing Rose's cheek gently and telling Marcel to take better care of her this time. Rose had cried for him, not with the devastating grief of lost love, but with the gentle sadness of letting go of something that had been good, but had never quite been right. Now it was September, and Emma was turning 6. Rose had planned a small party in her backyard, just family and a few friends from Emma's kindergarten class. Marcel arrived early, to help set up, as had become their custom for important events. They moved around each other with practiced efficiency, hanging streamers and setting up tables, their coordination speaking to the years they'd once shared as partners in everything. "Daddy, can you help me with my party dress?" Emma called from the house, and Rose smiled at the sound. Emma had never called David Daddy, despite his patient encouragement. That title had always belonged to Marcel alone. As the afternoon progressed, Rose found herself watching Marcel more than she should have. He'd changed over the past 6 years, grown into the man she'd always believed he could be. The cocky swagger of his youth had been replaced by something quieter but stronger, the confidence that came from facing your worst self and choosing to rebuild from the ruins. He was gentle with the children at the party, patient with the elderly relatives who confused him with other people, and attentive to Emma in ways that made Rose's heart ache with recognition. This was the Marcel she'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who'd been buried under layers of fear and immaturity but had never truly disappeared. As the party wound down and the last guest departed, Marcel began cleaning up without being asked. Rose watched him fold chairs and stack plates, marveling at how natural it felt to have him in her space again. "You don't have to stay," she said, though she hoped he would. "I want to," Marcel replied simply. "Besides, Emma's been asking me to." Read her the new book she got for her birthday. Emma was, in fact, already in her pajamas and waiting impatiently with her new picture book about a little girl who wanted to be an astronaut. Marcel settled into the reading chair that had once been his. Emma curled up against his side, and Rose found herself lingering in the doorway, listening to his familiar voice bring the story to life. When Emma finally fell asleep, Marcel carried her to her bed with the practiced ease of a father who'd done this countless times. Rose tucked her daughter in, kissing her forehead gently, and then she and Marcel found themselves standing in Emma's doorway together, watching their sleeping child in the dim light of her nightlight. "She's perfect," Marcel whispered, and Rose nodded, not trusting her voice. They made their way downstairs in comfortable silence, but instead of heading for the door, Marcel stopped in the living room. Rose could see him gathering his courage, preparing to say something that would change everything between them. "Rose," he began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair in the gesture she remembered so well. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." Rose's heart began to race, but she nodded, settling onto the couch and watching him pace in front of her coffee table. "I've been thinking about what David said at the hospital, about how I need to take better care of you this time. And the thing is, I want there to be a this time. I want it more than I've ever wanted anything in my life." Marcel stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you. I know I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too scared and too selfish to appreciate what I had. I know I can never undo the worst night of your life, can never take back missing Emma's birth, can never erase the pain I caused you." His voice broke slightly, but he continued, "But Rose, I love you. I've loved you every single day for the past 6 years, and I'll love you for the rest of my life, whether you forgive me or not. I love the way you sing off-key in the shower. I love how you cry at dog videos on the internet. I love how fierce you are when you're protecting Emma, and how gentle you are when she's scared. I love your laugh and your tears and your anger and your joy." Rose felt her own tears beginning to fall as Marcel's words washed over her. "I love the woman you were when we were married, and I love the woman you've become since. I love the mother you are to our daughter, and I love the strength you found to rebuild your life without me. I love every single thing about you, Rose. Frank and I would spend the rest of my life trying to prove that to you if you'd let me." Marcel knelt down in front of her then, taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I'm not asking you to pretend the past 6 years didn't happen. I'm asking you to let me love you the way I should have loved you from the beginning, completely, honestly, with everything I have." Rose looked down at their joined hands, his larger ones, scarred now from years of honest labor and sacrifice, still gentle as they held hers. She thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the betrayal and divorce, the anger and hurt, the slow process of watching Marcel transform from the selfish man who had destroyed their family into someone who had spent 6 years proving he could be worthy of a second chance. "You broke me," she whispered, and Marcel's face crumpled with pain. "That night, when I was giving birth to our daughter, and you were with another woman, you broke something in me that I didn't think could ever be fixed." "I know," Marcel said, his voice barely audible. "I know, and I'm so sorry. But you know what?" Rose continued, and something in her voice made Marcel look up. "Broken things can heal. Sometimes they heal stronger than they were before." Rose stood up, pulling Marcel to his feet with her. "I loved you when we were young and stupid and thought love was enough to fix everything. I hated you when I realized love wasn't enough if it wasn't paired with respect and commitment and showing up when it mattered. And now," She reached up to touch his face, her thumb tracing along his cheekbone. "Now I love you again, but it's different. It's not the blind, trusting love of a girl who thought nothing could hurt her. It's the careful, hard-won love of a woman who knows exactly what she's risking and chooses to risk it anyway." Marcel's breath caught. "Rose." "I forgive you, Marcel Smith," she said, and the words seemed to lift a weight from both their shoulders. "I forgive you for the affair, for missing Emma's birth, for all the pain and the years we lost. I forgive you because holding on to that anger was poisoning the good things in my life, and because the man standing in front of me now has earned the right to be forgiven." Marcel cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers. "Does this mean—" "It means I love you," Rose said simply. "God help me, I still love you. I probably never stopped loving you, even when I hated you." When Marcel kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. It felt like forgiveness and hope and the promise of new beginnings. Rose kissed him back, with 6 years of suppressed longing, 6 years of grief and growth, and the slow, painful process of learning to trust again. When they finally broke apart, both were crying, tears of relief and joy, and the overwhelming gratitude that comes with second chances. "We have a lot to figure out," Rose said, her forehead resting against his. "We have the rest of our lives to figure it out," Marcel replied, and for the first time in 6 years, both of them believed that might actually be true.